Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada on December 15th, 2025. Today, we're pleased to be joined again by Elina Xenophontos. Elina is a geopolitical analyst and international law and globalization specialist based in Cyprus. Thank you very much for joining us today, Elina.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. It's always a pleasure to be back.
In fact, the last time we had you on, that turned out to be one of our most widely watched videos of 2025. So I hope we can even do better this time. And in that regard...
Yes. I was very, I felt very honored for how people obviously took that episode specifically. So hopefully we can beat our record now. It's a good little opportunity.
And in that regard, let me just remind our viewers that if you do find this video to be informative, please do like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, please become one and help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. So, Elina, the Eastern Mediterranean seems in many ways to lie on the front line of an historic unfolding struggle between Western states led by the US and the rising powers of the non-Western world, principally China, Russia, India, and Iran. And Cyprus is geographically situated in the heart of this hotly contested region. Sometimes it seems hard to keep up with all the conflicts and the subterfuge in the region. And my first question for you arises from an article published 1 week ago by Intelligence Online. Before this interview, I sent you a link to it. And here you can see the headline to the article. According to this piece in Intelligence Online, the CIA is on the hunt to buy a dozen secondhand and unmarked C-130 Hercules military transport planes so that they can't be identified. And the article claims that once equipped with a fleet of these aircraft, the CIA intends to keep them at Turkey's base in Genocide, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the Turkish-occupied north of Cyprus. And the CIA's plan, it says, is to establish a secret air base in the Mediterranean for its clandestine operations in partnership with Turkey's MIT Foreign Intelligence Service. It says the CIA wants to maintain a covert striking force close to Lebanon and especially Syria, where the MIT is already very active on the ground. So my first question to you, Elina, is just basically, do you find the claims made in this article to be credible? Is this something that would be consistent with prior U.S. behavior in Cyprus?
In a way it is, and it isn't. And I'll explain what I mean. I mean, to understand in what ways it is, you kind of have to contextualize sort of Cyprus's own history. And Cyprus's history in this, is a complex one. But even if we were to go, back to, I guess, 1960 and after the establishment of its own, autonomy and state after the end of British colonial rule of Cyprus, there was a lot of intercommunal violence that was in many ways sort of originated under the British sort of colonial rule of the island that established all these, ethno-religious lines that didn't exist prior to the British rule. I mean, it was the British that introduced the concepts of Greek and Turkish. This didn't exist. It was just a Cypriot population that was Christian and that was Muslim. And then eventually they brought in these sort of ethnic identities that created internalized divides. And this unfortunately kind of continued after the 1960 establishment of the state, which led to a lot of intercommunal violence and what I would define as a bit of a constitutional coup that the president at the time had established in 1963. Fundamentally because of these irreconcilable differences and the issues that as a result of the constitution that was problematic. Now, what I mean by that is there was a constitution that was sort of drafted by the British, where essentially a Greek-speaking Cypriot will always be head of the state and the Turkish-speaking Cypriot will always be, vice president. And then there was all these other, separate parliamentary systems in place, and very similar to Lebanon. I think the best way to describe it is a very similar sort of constitution that was established by the French in Lebanon, which caused a lot of internal strife. And the reason I bring this up is because in 1964, after obviously the collapse of the Constitution as a result of certain decisions that were made by the president at the time, which I don't necessarily agree with, but this was the situation. In 1964, the United States, which is has put forward a plan, and the plan was called the Johnson Plan. And this Johnson Plan had essentially laid out the division of Cyprus. This was 10 years before the coup of 1974 and obviously the subsequent invasion and occupation. And the idea was to give Turkey the northern part of Cyprus, which it really wanted because, as we've said before, I think in our previous episode, Cyprus is a very geostrategically important location. It's right by the Nexus-Suez Canal. It's the sort of springboard. It's part of West Asia and sort of the entrance into West Asia, but it also is, right next to the African continent as well. It's at a crossroads of three different kind of, I guess, continents.
Before you
and
continue,
so it was,
I'm sorry,
yeah.
just to clarify one thing. You said in 1964, and you called it the Johnson Plan. So I take it that this was Lyndon B. Johnson administration putting this forward.
Yes.
Right after or shortly after the assassination of JFK, and
Yes.
almost as soon as Johnson came to power, basically.
Yes, exactly. 100%. And the plan was to give Turkey the northern part of Cyprus and to provide and to give the southern part of Cyprus to Greece. And at the time, Turkey had accepted this, but Greece did not accept this. And they didn't want Turkey to have that sort of degree of control over Cyprus at the time. And however, as time progressed, and we had obviously the junta fascist regime in Greece that came to power in 1967, they pushed forward to materialize this because we know at the time there was a lot of material and logistical support that was given by the American intelligence to the junta regime at that point in time that was established in Greece. Now,
the colonel who took power was actually a CIA agent, as I recall.
Yes, he was. A lot of them were, and a lot of them were actually even trained by the CIA. A lot of like the leading sort of military commanders were, trained and armed and funded by the CIA. And the reason behind this was because it was very important for the United States, especially during the Cold War era, to establish control over key Eastern Mediterranean states. That would include Greece, as well as Cyprus. And they understood that, first of all, at that point, you had two NATO countries that were in conflict with each other. You had Turkey and Greece, who were in conflict over the Cyprus issue, which to me has always been bizarre because there's very little respect for the indigenous population of the island. But this was the scenario. So in order to appease both NATO allies for the United States in this scenario, the idea was to divide the island into two so as to appease Turkey and Greece, and to secure Cyprus as a permanent sort of NATO base, even though Cyprus itself is not an actual NATO member, but it is functioning in many ways as a kind of a colony at this particular point. It's a colony of imperialism in the region, with the British bases, obviously, as you know, in Akrotiri and Tekeya, but also obviously in the north with Turkey's own military bases, and Turkey itself is a NATO member state. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because Cyprus has always acted and always been important within the sort of, I guess, the West's need to control and assert its authority within the region. And we're seeing that play out now. So going back to your question, would this article in any way deflect away, or does it align with the West's policy in Cyprus? Well, to a certain degree it does, because of what I've just mentioned. Cyprus is always meant to act as sort of this base by which to, infiltrate the rest of the region. So the idea that the United States wants to establish or infiltrate the north where Turkish bases are located would make sense, because that was the entire purpose of establishing or providing or giving rather the Turkish state, the north of Cyprus. Because just to actually clarify this, because I just realized that I didn't, the Johnson Plan was established in 1964, but by 1974 there was a coup in Cyprus that Kissinger was very well aware of on the 15th of July, and there's ample evidence to prove that they pretty much almost wanted the coup to happen, because they knew, based on the constitution of Cyprus, that given that Greece and Turkey were guarantors, that Turkey would invade. They understood that this would be an opportunity that Turkey was looking for to invade, and which at that point was actually legitimate because it was a guarantor and therefore had the right to protect the Turkish-speaking community from those who had conducted the coup at the time under the orders of the Greek junta regime in Greece, and obviously EOGAP here in Cyprus. And so they had the right at that point to interject and to establish sort of safety enclaves. And unfortunately, the violence continued over the course of the month when there was supposed to be conversations towards a ceasefire. And then after that point, on the 20th of August, Turkey expanded its occupation outside of those enclaves and took the very territory that was agreed upon 10 years prior. And this was done with the perfect knowledge this was going to happen. And a little fun fact, the only country that recognized the new temporary leadership of Cyprus after the 15th of July, after the coup, was the United States, almost instantly. There was no questions as to the legitimacy of an illegal coup in the country. They automatically recognized the Nikos Samson at the time, who had taken the position of president for that short period of time. So you see here how the United States used the internal conflict in Cyprus that was brought about by the British to establish to divide the island and provide Turkey with the bases in order to secure Cyprus as a NATO sort of stronghold. And to push back against the Soviet Union at the time. And this was actually one of the reasons as well the Soviet Union was arming the Cypriot leadership at the time to push back against any possible coup. Because the Soviet Union understood that if the West and NATO took control over Cyprus by dividing the island, then Cyprus would fall firmly within the control of the West. And that would have been a great strategic loss to the Soviet Union at the time. Things haven't changed much since. What has changed, however, is Turkey's position within the West. It's no longer considered to be a stable and reliable ally, fundamentally because it has its own aspirations to become an energy hub and a power hub within the region that threatens Israel and American interests within the region. Because the way the West operates is that they have these international alliances. And the idea is to establish a form of an alliance that's able to kind of assert their own agenda within the region. However, after a certain point, some of these alliances, their interests will begin to diverge. And we're seeing that happen between Turkey, Israel, and the United States.
Can we just park that for a second? I'm going to come back to competition between Israel and Turkey. I'd like to just focus on something you said a moment ago about the recognition of this new, back in 1967 or 74, I believe it was. That was when the occupation began. You indicated that the U.S. government was the only one that recognized it, but on this today on the website of the State Department, it says this. Quote, the government of the Republic of Cyprus is the only internationally recognized government on the island. But since 1974, the northern third of Cyprus has been administered by Turkish Cypriots. This area proclaimed itself the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or TRNC, in 1983. The United States does not recognize the TRNC, nor does any other country than Turkey. So what is the reality here, Elina? Whose side is Washington on in this dispute over the division of the island? I mean, you know, as we all know, Turkey is a member of NATO. At no point during this entire interminable occupation, which I believe is the second longest occupation ongoing in the world today, only the occupation of the Palestinian territories is longer than this one. And at no point does it seem that Turkey's status within NATO was in jeopardy because of its illegal occupation. At no point did the West impose any meaningful sanctions on Turkey, even though it doesn't hesitate to impose crushing sanctions on other governments that don't do the bidding of Washington. And so I guess my question is simply, in your opinion, whose side is Washington actually on here?
Its own side. It's always looking out for its own interests. And this is what I was trying to say. Up until now, Turkey served its purpose. It was able to act as an agent for NATO and, I guess, Western imperialism in the region. But because now it's also acting in order to guarantee its own interests within the region, whether that be in Syria, Lebanon, and it also wants to have access to the new international stabilization force in Palestine. The United States, and we've seen a lot of articles and research papers, you know, even published by the Atlantic Council and the RAND Corporation, is essentially acting outside of its accepted role. It's now trying to assume too much power, and its own expansionist, let's just say, ambitions is threatening the United States' interests within the region. It does not want a powerful Turkey, just to put it as bluntly as possible. They do not want a Turkey that has influence over Syria, Cyprus, potentially Lebanon, because Erdogan has expressed, desires to incorporate the northern part of Lebanon, which he considers to be, which is a more Turkmen and Sunni Muslim stronghold, because a powerful Turkey will threaten American interests. So this is what I meant earlier, where their interests aligned up to a certain point, but now due to Turkey's own aspirations, we're seeing that divergence take place. And what we're seeing is that the United States and Israel are trying to, coerce Turkey back into submission. And that's what we're seeing taking place in Cyprus. So, I mean, I don't know if I was going to bring up something which I think was very important. In August of this year, I think the later part of August, there was a new amendment that was passed in the House of Representatives. And basically, this amendment pushed for a report to be basically put together within 180 days that would look into Turkey's role within the north of Cyprus and to what extent does it threaten American interests, but also the interests of Israel, the United Kingdom, and all its allies, including, Greece, Cyprus, etc. And the accusations have been, and we saw that, and I think we mentioned this in the previous episode that we had with Israel Hayom discussing how the Cyprus problem is an Israeli problem because allegedly Turkey is funding terrorist organizations to function and act within the north of Cyprus. This sentiment was also echoed through this new amendment that was passed in the House of Representatives. So there is an assessment that's now taking place. So what we're looking at is this revived interest in Cyprus, not because the United States cares or because Israel cares about Cyprus or its occupation. No, up until this point, the occupation was serving the West in multiple ways because, as I said, it provided this NATO stronghold over Cyprus, and they were able to use that and use Turkey because, Turkey was also arming and funding, movements and rebels in Syria through the north of Cyprus. But now the geopolitical reality has changed, and Turkey's position is now becoming what they consider to be a threat to their own interests. And so that's why we're seeing that new revived interest in Turkey with regards to Turkey. And this new research, or rather this new research that the new amendment is putting through in terms of trying to publish a report as to a danger, a risk assessment with regards to Turkey's occupation in the north, is meant to act as a form of pressure. That's how I see it on Turkey. If Turkey is to continue to occupy the north, it will have to do so with the, acceptance of the United States, meaning, right, you're in the north of Cyprus, but if you will be, and this is why I find this report to be somewhat credible, we want access to the bases there. We want to have our own intelligence apparatus based there because we want to have access and monitor what Turkey is doing, and also have access to Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, which, like I said, was why Cyprus is so geostrategically important. This is why I actually do give a lot of credit to this, and I do believe it's something that's possible. And interestingly, I would say Cyprus's entire independence, or in any potential for a one-state solution, is going to be defined not by the will of the Cypriot people, but actually by the geopolitical, material realities, and to what extent Turkey is going to be willing to make significant sort of capitulations to Israel and the West, bearing in mind, and I do want to bring this to the attention of the audience, that because you have a more larger audience in terms of an international audience, there was actually 2 weeks ago in the north, in the occupied territories in the north, elections, and the elections saw a candidate win that wants a one-state solution in Cyprus. This was to the dismay of Turkey. So we're seeing a lot of pressure on Turkey at the moment. So you have, the Cypriot population in the north who want a one-state solution with, their fellow Cypriots in the south. You've got Israel applying a lot of pressure, and you've got the United States at the moment who is conducting this new report and taking a new revived interest in the northern in the occupation of the north. And basically, it's going to come down to the point where they're going to have to make strategic, capitulations to the West if they want to sustain the occupation, or I think they will be eventually pushed out, but not because the United States cares about the Cypriot people or the occupation, but because it's what serves them at this point in time.
So let's assume, for purposes of a discussion, that this report is true.
Mhm.
this secret base ain't secret anymore. So
No.
I can't imagine that the Cypriot government is not aware of this report. And my question to you is, assuming that it is aware and that it takes the report seriously, I would think that it would complain vigorously and publicly about this, because it is a frontal assault on international law and the stated official position of the U.S. State Department that it doesn't recognize this self-declared republic. What do you think the the Greek-Cypriot government, the government based, the only one recognized by the international community over the island of Cyprus, is going to do about this report, if anything?
So the current leadership has made it very clear that they are leaning towards the West. They want to strengthen their alliances with the United States. And there is this belief that if they ally themselves with the United States and Israel, that it will be the force necessary to expel Turkey, and that the United States will eventually sort of um, allow for, I guess, like a one-state solution to happen under the Republic of Cyprus as a unified single state, but providing that the United States itself will have strong military bases here and assets that it can, I guess, use within the region. This is, as far as I can see it, they think that they're making certain strategic gains by working with the US. They're aware of what the US is trying to do in the north, but they view that as a means to dilute Turkey's control in the north, which is what's important to them. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that's ridiculous. But this is kind of the way in which the argument is being shaped by the political establishment here, that the United States is somehow going to infiltrate into the north, take control over, I guess, the occupation in the north to a certain degree, and also find a way to push out Turkey or limit Turkey's control and influence, which the Cypriot government then wants to capitalize off of in terms of achieving its own goals and aspirations. But I think that the reality of this actually materializing in the way that they want, it's not going to work. And yeah, I think this is also, I don't know if you wanted to bring up the second article that you sent me, because I think it's also, I think it aligns, but I
Why
don't
don't
know
we
if you want to show.
know,
Yeah.
because another very interesting, juicy
Mm-hmm.
tidbit that came out of some publications that aren't too widely read by people in the West, but nonetheless, they're significantly influential in foreign policy circles. So this
Mm-hmm.
article was I guess I'll call it a thought piece by somebody named Michael Rubin, who's a former Pentagon official and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum. So he's kind of like a bigwig in the Western foreign policy elite. And last month in the National Security Journal, they published an article authored by Michael Rubin titled "Send Israeli Peacekeepers to Cyprus." Now, when I read this for the first time I saw the headline, I have to just say I laughed out loud, because as far as I know, there ain't no such thing as an Israeli peacekeeper. It never has been. But let's just put that little detail aside. So he goes on and he says, and by the way, it's hard to say whether he's being serious here. I'll get back to
Mm-hmm.
that. Says, why don't we send Israeli peacekeepers to northern Cyprus? After all, they're talking about sending Turkish troops as part of the International Stabilization Force under this fraudulent peace plan for Gaza that Trump formulated. And so the way I read the article, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. That's just my impression, that basically what he's saying is, when the Turks say, let us send our troops to Gaza, tell them we're going to send our troops. The Israelis are going to send their troops to northern Cyprus, and that'll bring an end to that whole discussion real quick, because the Turks are never going to tolerate any Israeli soldiers in the occupied north of Cyprus. But this article does raise a larger question, and I certainly invite you to comment on the article itself, and that is, what is the reality of Turkish-Israeli relations? And on the one hand, if you were only to pay attention to the fiery rhetoric of Erdogan, you would think that there is intense enmity between Turkey and Israel. On the other hand, and there are other reasons to think that there's genuine tension there, But on the other hand, it's my understanding that a large amount of Azerbaijani oil has been traveling to the genocidal entity through Turkish territory throughout this genocide. The Turks played an instrumental role in the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, and that was a long-term strategic goal of Israel. And although they may not be, huge fans of al-Jolani, they certainly prefer al-Jolani to Bashar al-Assad, because al-Jolani, at least superficially, is intensely hostile to Hezbollah and Iran, and doesn't seem to have any interest whatsoever in starting a fight with Israel, even though Israel is gobbling up more and more territory in southern Syria. So you look at all of this, and one wonders, what is the true nature of the relationship between Turkey and Israel? Are they enemies or are they frenemies?
I would say frenemies. This is kind of what I was trying to say before when I said that these Israel and the United States and Turkey, they worked closely together in Syria. That's one classic example. Much like you rightfully stated, we know that Turkey was funding a lot of the opposition, just like Israel was, just like the United States, and they had very close relationships with Jolani as well. And it was paramount to them for their own strategic interest to sort of get rid of Bashar al-Assad, fundamentally because Bashar al-Assad as well, not because they care whether he was a dictator. No, it had to do with their own sort of interest at the time. And Bashar al-Assad had sort of strategically aligned himself with Iran and Russia with the pipelines that he had agreed to establish that would be going through Russia and Iran into basically Syria and to connect Asia, essentially West Asia, and the EU. And to do that, he had actually outright rejected the Turkish-Qatar Syria pipeline option. That's one such example. Something that is often kind of overlooked is the great relationship that Bashar al-Assad had actually had with Erdogan. They had a very close relationship prior to the Syrian uprising that had actually taken place. And in the first few months of the uprising, the general chaos that ensued in Syria, Erdogan had actually said he would side with him if he allows for the Muslim Brotherhood to take, key political positions inside his government, which Bashar al-Assad had rejected. So we can see here that Erdogan was trying to exploit the internalized chaos that was also pushed externally for at least a decade prior. We have obviously a lot of the intelligence data that was published by WikiLeaks, for example, a 2006 cable that is a very good references to how these operations in Syria were ongoing about a decade prior to even 2011. But he was trying to use the vulnerability of the situation that Bashar al-Assad was in to take significant control over Syria, because Syria is a very geostrategically important country. It connects the East with the West as well. It's also very rich in resources, and to establish a type sort of pipelines and trade routes and digital trade routes through that region, and then connect that to Turkey as opposed to sidetracking Turkey, was something that Erdogan wanted in order to establish that sort of energy power hub that he was looking for. So he did ally with Israel at the time. And I think it was an interview as well that I saw recently in the Underground sort of segment with even a former CIA sort of chief that was stationed in Tel Aviv, openly stating that, Israel, the United States, Turkey, they were all allying together, even with Al-Qaeda, having open communications and discourse on how to essentially, overthrow Bashar al-Assad, of which Jolani was a member of. Al-Nusra, HTS, these were the Al-Qaeda sort of branches of Syria. But he did, we can see here that they have allied because Turkey has its own expansionist objectives and its own goals in terms of becoming an energy hub and kind of becoming a huge, powerful heavyweight in the region. But Israel has its own agenda, as does the West. And this is why I said when the Assad sort of regime collapsed, now what we're seeing is all these parties that work together, allied together to bring about the situation in Syria, all now have conflicting interests. So this is what we're seeing with Turkey and Israel. They're trying to balance out, their own agenda. But it's irreconcilable. And the party that will win here will be the party that has the United States to back it. And although Turkey is a very powerful military, has a very powerful military, one of the largest in the world. However, Turkey's economy is so incredibly weak from years of poor economic policies by Erdogan. The fact that the Turkish lira is constantly significantly devalued, and with some of the highest levels of inflation, means that the vast majority of the Turkish population actually use the dollar and crypto in order to be able to fund their economies. Most small to medium-sized businesses in Turkey use the dollar, which means that they're very vulnerable to fluctuations with the dollar, and especially something like sanctions. Even the most minute sanctions could sink the entire Turkish economy. That would send, massive political shockwaves throughout Turkey. And Erdogan is already struggling to hold on to power inside Turkey, as we've seen. There's been lots of mass protests against Erdogan in Turkey, with the way that he's been arresting opposition and placing them in jail on questionable corruption scandals, etc. So Erdogan is in a very vulnerable position at the moment. He's trying to manifest his I guess the goals and aspirations that he had within Syria and Cyprus and even Libya, as we know, based on the 2019, maritime deal that it established with Libya in order to, secure gas extraction within the region. Again, sort of highlighting the desire to be this energy hub. But it's meeting, I guess it's the consequences of its own actions. This is what happens when you ally with Israel and the United States, and especially when you're the weaker party of the two. So yes, they're frenemies. It's the best way that I can describe it. They allied together, but now their interests are no longer aligning. And it would have been much better for Turkey if it had began strategically aligning itself with China, Russia, BRICS, and the BRI a good decade ago. Turkey would not be in this position today. And unfortunately, it has also, by helping Israel and the United States in the region achieve their own objectives, they have unleashed massive destabilization in the region as part of the whole new Middle East that the West wants to establish. And this is obviously going to have a massive impact in Cyprus as well as Syria and Lebanon and Palestine.
I want to come back to you with questions about Syria in a moment, but I'm curious about the internal politics of Turkey from your perspective. If the opposition were to come to power, the people in the opposition who seem best poised to do that, do you expect that would result in a policy that is more oriented towards the BRICS, or do you think that would bring Turkey back closer to the Washington camp than it is even now?
Yeah, I have actually been asked this question twice in the last 12 hours, and I will tell you, unfortunately, I would say in Turkey, the two sort of main political factions are Erdogan's sort of ideologues, which is premised on this neo-Ottoman ideology and conservatism that obviously appeals to certain fractions of Turkish society. But and in that context, they ally based on what interests them, but they have been more so a Western ally than otherwise. But the opposition is mostly a centrist liberal party, essentially, that for the most part is very pro-EU and pivots more to the West. There isn't really a legitimate party that I would say, which has any potential of coming to power, that would see Turkey at this particular point pivot towards, I guess, BRICS, which is unfortunate because I believe that Turkey's prosperity would come in changing its strategic alliances, which, when you're a Eurasian country yourself, you probably should be looking at. But unfortunately, from my understanding and from what I've seen in the internal politics of Turkey, it's either option leaves Turkey firmly within the realm of Western control, which is going to have some very negative repercussions on Turkey going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we go to Syria, also, I want to ask you about this one detail about this Rubin article, which I just put up here on the screen. There was a comment in there about a flag that the Turks have carved into the side of a mountain in the occupied north.
Yes.
So, can you tell us about that comment?
I found that particularly entertaining, but also alarming to a certain extent because you never know. And actually, I will make a comment about the article as a whole. But the quote that you're talking about is, for those that don't know, is that on the mountain of Pentadactylos, after this sort of the establishment, so to speak, of the Turkish Republic of the North of Cyprus, there's a flag, and the flag somewhat resembles that of Israel's because it's white with a red stripe on top and a red stripe underneath. and obviously the crescent moon, etc., like similar to Turkey in the middle. And so the article says, well, if we send Israeli peacekeeping forces to Cyprus, all we have to do is just add a bit of blue in there, and basically this massive flag that's sitting on the mountain that the entire capital can see will be an Israeli flag, just to symbolize Israel's peacekeeping forces, which for the most part, if anything, it just looks like a revamp of the occupation, moving from Turkey to Israel of the north. And I just actually want to say, however outlandish the article may seem, there are some concerns that I have, because going back to as well a lot of the articles and that I've been seeing coming out of Israel, and this focus on Cyprus, this focus on the so-called liberation of Cyprus, which is absolutely, Israel wants to liberate Cyprus from a brutal occupation, ironically. Israel does want to limit Turkey's control, and I think what this article argues is, if Turkey wants to have any sort of influence within, I guess, Palestine, in order to maintain leverage, this is what Israel is looking. I think this is what the article is arguing. If we want to maintain any sort of leverage against Turkey, we need to effectively infiltrate the sort of the green line, the border between the Republic of Cyprus and the occupation, and get rid of the United Nations peacekeeping forces and take control over that particular border. Fundamentally, yeah, this is it. So you can see very quick little artistic changes, and we've got apparently like the flag of Israel, so everybody can see. It also flashes lights in the evening, sort of like the Eiffel Tower, so we can really get a good taste of that. If a good old-fashioned Israeli flag, just flashing lights for everybody to see. But yeah, for me, what was alarming is this interest that Israel has, the mass property purchases, the way that they're re-narrating the narrative around Cyprus and liberating Cyprus, and aligning with Greece and the Cypriot military in order to essentially push for that liberation, even through military means. And now, so articles that are even entertaining this, as ridiculous as it may seem, placing Israeli peacekeeping forces just to have that advantage over Turkey, if Turkey even thinks of overstepping Israel inside of Palestine. I think there is some. I do give them some sort of importance, because there is an increasing hostility between both parties here, and they're both trying to, I guess, pull the rug from under each other. And so they need to get these strategic positionings, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Cyprus, in order to maintain some sort of hold over Turkey, because Israel does not like, nor does the United States, the fact that at the end of the day, the Turkish Republic of the North Cyprus, which is an occupation simply because it's the Turkish military that's sustaining it, and there is the Turkish military rule court is the prevailing court of the North. It's because it's not internationally recognized. There's very little knowledge as to what actually happens in the North, outside of what Turkey allows to sort of be known. And this is something that the West is not comfortable with. And this is why I think this could be something that they could be. I mean, I don't think they're going to completely get rid of the peacekeeping forces, but will they try to maybe position themselves on the border? Will this be something that will be put forward if Turkey does not make certain concessions? Possibly, because we're already seeing these conversations with regards to liberation of the North from Turkey, because they want to assert their own control. And like I said before, the people that will suffer will be, unfortunately, the population in the North and in the South.
So let's focus now on recent developments in Syria. Over the weekend, we learned that 2 U.S. soldiers were killed, assassinated by a Syrian near the city of Palmyra. And we're also told that a civilian interpreter who was with them was killed, and that 3 others were injured, 3 other Americans. And according to U.S. authorities, the 2 soldiers who died were attacked while they were, quote, conducting a key leader engagement as part of their assigned mission in the ongoing counter-ISIS and counter-terrorism efforts in the region, close quote. So the Trump regime claims that the killer was from ISIS. According to the Syrian regime of Abu Mohammed al-Julani, the former ISIS leader, well, we think he's former, who had a $10 million CIA bounty on his head until very recently, The killer of these U.S. soldiers was a member of the Syrian security forces, and the Syrian Interior Ministry spokesman Nuruddin al-Baba told state television that they, quote, had decided to fire, quote, the perpetrator from the security forces before the attack for holding extremist Islamist ideas, and had planned to do this on Sunday. So they apparently didn't fire him quite in time to prevent this attack on these U.S. soldiers. The Syrian regime now says, as you can see from this Al Jazeera article I put up on the screen, that it has arrested 5 people in connection with the attack. So this obviously suggests that the killer did not act alone, and he was part of a larger conspiracy. So the Trump regime predictably has vowed fiery revenge. On social media, U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth wrote, "Let it be known, if you target Americans anywhere in the world, you will spend the rest of your brief, anxious life knowing the United States will hunt you, find you, and ruthlessly kill you," close quote. So before we get into what all of this means, Elina, what are U.S. troops doing in Syria to begin with? They just had al-Jolani in the White House. He's now supposed to be one of the good guys. Bashar al-Assad is gone. So what do you think U.S. troops are actually doing there?
Well, I mean, the U.S. troops have been there since I think it was 2018 when Trump had essentially bombarded Syria and then placed troops specifically around the oil sort of sector of Syria, and they've been monitoring and paroling that area ever since. But they haven't left. Even after, obviously, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the American military is still very much present, and they also aligned with the SDF, which is the Kurdish sort of movement inside of Syria. So this is why they're still very much present. And the reality of the situation is, much like you said, although Jolani has come into power, which is, I guess, now he's part of the good guys. He was at the White House. He's been accepted by all international sort of Western states, rather, and they even have removed, the 10 million,
10 million.
yeah, bounty on his head. But the reality is that they understand that Jolani, who, as I said earlier, has actually closer ties and allegiances towards Turkey and Erdogan, is not a reliable partner. And I guess what these recent attacks actually mean in the greater context of things is it speaks to the massive internal divides and within the Syrian movement itself, but also to the radicalization of the vast majority of these, individuals that were part of HTS, that were part of all these opposition groups. Because one of the main criticisms that a lot of people had about the Syrian opposition was fundamentally that a bulk of them, and I think it's actually when the BBC had published a report back in 2015, 2016, is that around 80% exhibited, extremist Islamic jihadist views. And even the Free Syrian Army, from 2011, that was backed by the United States and the West, quickly dismantled because a lot of them had actually chosen to join groups like al-Nusra, which Jolani was ahead of, which we know it was the official al-Qaeda branch of Syria. So we know that these individuals that are part of these movements and part of these organizations, whether they've changed their name from al-Nusra to HTS, they still harbor a lot of these radical opinions because this was the fundamental base for a huge chunk of the opposition fighters. So what we're seeing manifest in Syria now is a consequence of what happens when you place radicals into a position of power. Even if Jolani himself has been trained by, American and Western intelligence, because, we've got it, obviously, the on record former, British, I think it was I forgot his name though. I think it was the MI6 agent who said that, he had even met with Jolani in 2022 and how they were basically helping cultivate him into how to be more of a diplomatic, political figure that would appeal to the Western audiences. So we can see how they cultivated him, but that won't necessarily reflect within the military structures that he's established, as which for the most part they were part and parcel of these extremist groups. So we're seeing now, although he's trying to keep some degree of control over these fighters, they are individuals that have very radical and extremist opinions. I mean, when you're part of groups like Al-Nusra or HTS or even ISIS, which ISIS and Al-Nusra were aligned until 2013, and people also forget ISIS initially was, and Baghdadi, he was the leader of ISIS. He was the leader of the Al-Qaeda branch of Iraq that then went on to become ISIS. So these are all very much part and parcel of the same ideological group, with internal fragmentations that were resulting more so in political differences and who was going to be the leader of the caliphate, and I guess more tactical differences more so than anything else. But again, these are radical groups, and Jolani is losing control over over these men who are not satisfied by playing by they've come, the HTS is now coming to power, but these are individuals that are looking for this radical ideological state, and they will now act out. And that's why we saw these attacks against US troops who have been stationed there, as I said, since 2018, and also the attacks against Israeli soldiers. So but this is Jolani losing control over these men is also the reason why we've seen sort of massive attacks against the Alawites, the continuous conflict with the Kurds, the Christians, and so forth. Even the Druze community, with massive massacres have been taking place in just the first year of his power, and there seems to be very little that he's able to do to contain these individuals. But I will say this is part and parcel of, I guess, placing a radical group in power in the first place. They were very well aware, the United States and Israel were very well aware that they would not be able to consolidate power. But what does this do? Divide and rule. And it was actually Israel that back in January had been pushing for international forces to be placed inside of Syria and to divide Syria into multiple different cantons that would be governed essentially by international authorities in order to protect supposedly the minorities. But they knew that this was going to happen when you place a radical group like that in power and give these individuals the arms and means and freedom to act in whatever way that they want. And Jolani would never be able to maintain power, and we're seeing that materialize.
Yeah. I just put up on the screen there the British diplomat who was involved in training him for his current
Jonathan Powell, that's it.
13-year-old, right? And apparently he was the head of a London-based NGO called Intermediate. Now, you did mention something I wanted to talk to you about related to all of this, which is the attack on the Israeli soldiers. This happened last month, and in the community of Beit Jin, which I understand is on the outskirts of Damascus. And what happened there, reportedly, is that Israeli forces, I think more accurately described as terrorists, tried to raid a village, the village of Beit Jin, and they were met with gunfire. And 6 of them were wounded, 3 of them seriously, and they retaliated by killing 13 villagers, including women and children. So that is, as far as I know, the first serious attack on Israeli forces since on Syrian territory since al-Jolani came to power. There may well have been others, but that certainly is the most widely publicized. And when you look at this in concert with, what happened to the U.S. soldiers, it does appear to those of us on the outside that Jolani's already quite a shaky grip on power in the country is slipping away. And is that your sense as well? And if that is what seems to be the current trajectory of the country, where will that likely lead, in your opinion?
So there's 2 different options here. So on the one hand, I would argue that, Jolani's control over Syria was never consolidated, and we've been seeing that manifest, what I said, throughout the year. On the other hand, one could argue that, perhaps these little incidences, let's just say, that have recently occurred is both, yes, a result of lack of control, but maybe even perhaps they were permitted to occur in order to push back against the United States and Israel, because, as I said, Jolani's alliances have been more so with Turkey as opposed to Israel and the United States. But whatever the scenario is, unfortunately, this will just lead to further violence for Syria, possible another civil war, and greater justification for infiltration and military control by Israel and the United States. because, as I said before, the United States has been strategically placed inside of Syria for a while now, supposedly, to monitor to protect the oil. That was part and parcel of controlling the resources of Syria, not to hollow out the Syrian economy and eventually sort of weaken Bashar al-Assad and throw him out of government. Has been a long-standing strategy. But beyond that point, there has also been, the United States has also been working in conjunction with Iraq for over a decade now, for 15 years now, supposedly to battle ISIS. This has been a strategic alliance between Iraq and obviously the United States. And we all know that in the last couple of years, the Iraqi leadership has requested that, the United States basically leaves Iraq because there's no longer the ISIS threat. But the United States has said yes, and then they say no, and then they they kind of keep going back and forth, although they have been making commitments to basically leave. The whole idea now of seeing a revival of ISIS or claiming it was an ISIS attack, as well as Israel doing the same thing, because Israel is claiming that they were making the whole purpose of the incursion or the raid was to target terrorists without really defining what these terrorists were, but also knowing fully well they're probably speaking about radical extremist, so-called jihadists who they helped bring to power in the first place, becomes a medium by which to justify further military occupation and expansionism for Israel, and also the military presence for the United States in Iraq and Syria, so that they don't necessarily have to leave. These attacks will continue to probably happen to justify further influence and infiltration into Syria, which will weaken, I guess, the sovereignty and the integrity of the Syrian state. And what's worse is that, the internal violence between all the different minority groups within Syria, and obviously the establishment at the moment in Syria, will most likely give the West and Israel even further justification, because we've seen as well Netanyahu, who has openly stated that Israel has now become the protector of the Druze community, for example. I mean, that, I love how Israel is liberating Cyprus and protecting the Druze whilst, committing mass genocide against the Palestinians. But, this is just the outlandish nature of these claims. But they're going to be using internalized violence within Syria to justify further expansion, further military operations within Syria, permanent occupation, and the United States, for its part, will also do the same, because right now, what we're seeing with the Trump administration is just that. They're trying to blame ISIS, whereas the Jolani's claiming that it's obviously not ISIS. Again, this kind of plays into the narrative that ISIS hasn't left the region and we need to still maintain our military presence there in order to, fight back. And this becomes even more, I guess, ridiculous when you begin to even go further and deeper into, the creation of ISIS, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, that the United States intelligence information and intelligence memos that we have going back from 2012, with the Jake Sullivan emails even, but also the intelligence memos that were confirmed by Michael Flynn, the United States wanted to establish a Salafist state within the region there because it would ally with their own interests. And they knew that this would, I guess, suppress and subjugate not the Palestinian resistance, rather the resistance more broadly, that will allow for the West to be able to better have its grips within the region. And, it's typical divide and rule, divide and conquer. And that's what's happening in Syria. And unfortunately, I think the future for Syria it's going to get even bloodier, with greater involvement by the United States, by Israel, by possibly Turkey, because, rounding back to Turkey has also been using the terror threat to continue its own occupation and expansionism inside of Syria, supposedly for security reasons, which is really no different to what Israel and the United States are doing inside Syria. So I think things will only escalate.
I've been to West Asia on many occasions since this genocidal horror began over 2 years ago. And a sentiment that I heard over and over again, Elina, I heard this from people in Lebanon. I heard it from people in Iraq, in Jordan. I heard it in people when I managed to get into Palestine last year, is that ISIS is a creation of the United States. And when I heard the sentiment, people didn't offer it up as kind of, half-hearted theory of theirs. They really firmly believed it. And most of the people who said this were people of the Shia persuasion, but there were people who were Sunni Muslims as well who shared this view. Do you think that there's truth to this? Is this ultimately a creation of the CIA or some other arm of the US government, this ISIS behemoth?
Yes. So again, when I spoke about the intelligence memo that was published and reaffirmed by Michael Flynn in an interview actually on Al Jazeera with Mehdi Hassan, who would actually question him on the intelligence memo. In that intelligence memo, it specifically outlines how the United States is working closely with Al Qaeda in the region, and it hopes to establish what I said earlier, which is a Salafist state, which is the Islamic State. And the idea was, therefore, to use that as a mechanism to kind of break Iraq away from Syria, to isolate and weaken the Syrian regime at the time, and to essentially use this force as a means to battle against the resistance factions within West Asia. That's just one such example of this information. This was then reaffirmed by WikiLeaks and the documents, the emails that was spent between Hillary Clinton and Jake Sullivan, and this was obviously proven by WikiLeaks leaked emails back in 2016. And we know, as I said earlier on, that we've even had now CIA officials who have confirmed that they were in open dialogue with Al Qaeda. And like I said, ISIS was the Al Qaeda branch of Iraq. That's how it originated. It was known as the Al Qaeda branch of Iraq, and then it went on to become ISIS. Jolani was taken under the wing of Baghdadi, who was the leader of ISIS, or the Al Qaeda branch of Iraq. And so when we're talking about this facilitation of, how ISIS was established, you can see the connections here. We know, based on intelligence memos, that they supported Al Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. We know that ISIS was the birth child of Al Qaeda. We know that Jolani was working alongside Baghdadi until 2013, when there was a split. And we also know that from 2012, based on the intelligence memo, and I think this is what Mehdi Hassan had actually questioned and really doubled down on in his interview with Michael Flynn from 2015. This interview is, if anybody's interested in watching, what he had argued at the time is, if we knew that the vast majority of the opposition in Syria were Al Qaeda, why were we funding them? This was Mehdi's, because this was in the intelligence memo. This means that the United States was very aware who they were arming, who they were funding, and they continue to arm and fund dangerous militants in the region. And I remember Michael Flynn's response to that was, I think it was something like a willful ignorance. They chose to overlook it because it served a strategic interest. So we know that they were funding ISIS. Though funding Al Qaeda, that then, and ISIS was a branch of Al Qaeda inside of Syria. And then we also know that the idea was to establish a Salafist state. So a lot of that funding to the so-called opposition was well known to be going to these groups. And that is why we can say with certainty at this point that when we're looking at ISIS and when we're looking at all these groups, Al-Nusra, et cetera, who are receiving this funding, they are the creation in many ways of the United States and Israel, and as a collective inside of the region in order to destabilize the region, and they've succeeded in that. So that's what's even more, I guess, almost antagonizes people in West Asia when they have to hear this sort of diegesis that the United States military in Israel is based there in order to protect and fight against ISIS, when they are the ones that have actively been backing, funding, and pushing the opposition, which they knew were, Al-Qaeda fighters and ISIS inside of Syria. But this is, unfortunately, the reality of the situation.
One piece of the Syrian puzzle we haven't discussed is Russia. When Bashar al-Assad fell, many of us assumed that it was only a matter of time between Russian forces would be obliged to withdraw from Syria, but they're still there. And as far as I can tell, there's no plan to end the Russian military presence. What do you think is going on there, Elina? Do you think that the Russians are there at the behest of al-Jolani? And if so, how is it that the Americans are putting up with that? Or do you think it's only a matter of time before they are obliged to withdraw from Syria?
it kind of goes back to what I was saying with Jelani. He's a man that's trying to balance an act. He's both trying to appease Israel and the United States, who are going to force him to make capitulations, but he also is more allied with Turkey, and Turkey does not itself completely capitulate to the left. It has its own, to the west. It has its own interests, and so they understand. Turkey and Jelani understand that having Russia maintain its bases there and not outright kicking them out becomes a bit of I guess they view it as leverage without completely capitulating, I guess, to the West and Israel. But it's and Russia itself, for its part, because we saw that Putin obviously had actually met with Jelani, and this was obviously met with a lot of frustration from a lot of international viewers. And of course, it does come across, in bad taste. But this is unfortunately how international diplomacy works. Russia wants to make sure that it preserves its own interests by not antagonizing the new internationally established regime and not appearing as wanting to intervene within Syrian affairs in that context. So it's attempting to enter into this dialogue with the new Syrian establishment. But I think Russia as well, it's very well aware of the weaknesses of the current establishment in Syria, and is trying to maintain whatever avenues of communication in order to preserve the bases. But my humble opinion is, this is why Syria at this moment is also under a lot of pressure. Jolani is under a lot of pressure. It has to do with his relationship with Turkey, I guess, how they're choosing to handle Russia as well. And ultimately, this is why I said I think that the power dynamics and the entirety of Syria and the new regime, it will most likely collapse. And when that happens, how Israel and the United States and the international community, aka the West, are going to try to monitor the, I guess, impending, I believe, new kind of civil war that I believe that Syria is in a state of civil war as we speak, with all the internalized violence. I would define it as it's in a state of civil war, to be honest with you. If they are to, for example, establish these international sort of cantons that they have spoken about, these single administrative units that are going to be monitored by international forces, what Russia's role will be there would be interesting. And will they try to push Russia out? You see, it's at the moment we're at that balancing point. So they're keeping Russia there, I guess, as I would say, fundamentally to be able to have that balancing act and not completely capitulate to the West in order to use it as a form of leverage. But how powerful that's going to be on the negotiating table with Israel and the United States, I don't know, unless Turkey completely realigns itself, as will Jolani. But I still find that to be a very hard call to make at this particular point.
Right. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is somewhat further afield, and that is the Ukraine war. On December 4th, so just about 10 days ago, the Cypriot President, Nikos Christodoulides, traveled to Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, to pledge support for Ukraine on its path to the European Union within the upcoming Cypriot presidency of the Council of the European Union, which begins on January 1st and will last for 6 months. Personally, just as an aside, I think there's zero chance, whatever the United States may want, whatever Zelensky may want, that Ukraine will actually become part of the European Union, at least in my lifetime. I also question why anyone would want to become part of the European Union at this stage, given its sorry, pathetic, and state. But my question to you, and if you want to comment on that, I'm happy for you to do so. But what I was primarily interested in, it seems like the Cypriot government has been quite a team player, shall we say, when it comes to supporting the NATO proxy in the Ukraine war. How do the people of Cyprus feel about that? And do you think that this has served the interests of the people of Cyprus?
The people of Cyprus are not very happy about that. It definitely has not served their interest, primarily because obviously Cyprus has been a bit of a haven, let's just say, for Russian money, tourism. I mean, the Russians have played a very significant role in the economy of Cyprus. In many ways, it has upheld the economy of Cyprus for several decades now, with the city of Limassol, for example, being called in some instances Little Moscow. They have their own, I mean, everywhere you go, you'll have things written in Greek or Turkish, English, and Russian. It's such a has such a significant role now in Cypriot society. And obviously, following the 2022 SMO in Ukraine, and the subsequent sort of action that the EU took against Russia, this has had very negative impacts on Cyprus, because obviously it has to abide by I guess the terms established by the EU, and also the leadership here, as I've said before, is more attempting to pivot to the West and to align itself with Western interests. That would include obviously the EU. And what we've seen is that there has been a massive sort of fleeing. A lot of Russians have actually left. In fact, we're seeing them buy properties now, more so even in the occupied territories, or they've just left entirely, because obviously of the sanctions war. So there's really no benefit for them here. And this has been to the detriment of the Cypriot economy and Cypriot business, who has heavily relied up until this point on Russians and Russian and the Russian tourism industry, but also just financial industry, etc. So it has been something that the Cypriot population is not very happy about, and they're rather vocal about. They would much prefer to still sustain a positive relationship with Russia that has actually invested a lot of money in Cyprus, as opposed to the West and the European Union that they view has actually been to the detriment overall on the Cypriot economy. Going back to the 2013 crisis and the bail-in, etc., there's a very negative view and a bitter taste as to how the Europeans treated Cyprus in that particular point in time, whereas there's a much more favorable sort of view with Russia. And bear in mind, when we're speaking about Russia, the frozen assets that even Russians have in Cyprus, I think comes to about, I think a bulk of it is here in Cyprus, with I think it's 100 billion. So that's actually even costing the Cypriot economy. And because of retaliation, obviously we've always seen Ursula von der Leyen constantly discussing how they wish to use and appropriate the Russian frozen assets in order to fund Ukraine, which is pure daytime theft. But we've seen this sort of narrative. Russia has responded by saying, well, it will freeze European assets inside Russia. A lot of that actually is, again, it's Cypriot assets. They have a bulk of that due to the relations between Russia and Cyprus up until this point. So yes, this is not something that the Cypriot population is happy about, but unfortunately, the political establishment here is very much tailored to appeasing the West to the detriment of its own progress. We're seeing that with regards to what's happening with its relationship with Israel, its relationship with Russia, and things are not looking very good.
So I've heard, this is the first I've heard, not at all surprised to hear it, but it's for some reason I had not heard before that I assume when you say that Russian assets are in Cypriot financial institutions, are you referring to the central bank assets, some part of the 300 billion that were frozen? Is that a significant?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes,
so
significant portion. I think it's like 100. I think 1/3 of that is in Cyprus.
So we've been hearing, over the past few weeks, the Belgian government has been pushing back hard on the idea that money, because some part of that money is in Belgian financial, in Euroclear, which is in Belgium. And it's been pushing back hard on the EU's insistence that the money be confiscated and basically used to fight the Ukraine war. I haven't heard anything from the Cypriot government about this. Is it pushing back at this, or is it on board with this idea that money is just going to be stolen?
It's on board with this idea. It's on board with this idea. This is why so many Cypriots are outraged. This is why so many Cypriots are outraged. And it's why I said to you, it's actually to the detriment of the Cypriot economy and its economic relations with Russia, which have been so significant in Cyprus's economy. And
not just Russia. Because if you're like a foreign investor, especially a foreign state or foreign investor who might one day run afoul of, the dictates of Washington or Brussels, why are you going to park your money in a Cypriot financial institution when they've just demonstrated their willingness to confiscate, people's money just based on the dictates of, the Western oligarchy? I mean, that's serious. I think that quite apart from how Russians will react to this, a lot of foreign investors are going to stay away from Cypriot financial institutions if they do this. Isn't that
I
fair?
completely agree with you. No, I completely agree with you. And that has been a situation that we have seen here. But there's this belief that, oh, well, that's just because it's Russians. But we, if you're a Western sort of investor, an Israeli, especially because Israelis are investing billions in Cyprus at the moment. Oh, well, they're kind of trying to replace it by allying themselves with the West, believing that investors are going to come from a different direction, that they feel, we are a reliable source of investment for you, but maybe not, for example, for belligerent actors. Let's just say Russia being a part of it. But it is a massive risk that the Cypriot state has taken. And honestly, just one of the many instances where the Cypriot government just seems to be acting against its own interest. I mean, it's just been a consistent state of acting against your own interest in Cyprus, it has outraged a lot of people. But what can you say?
So since we're on the subject of the Cypriot government doing things that are outraging the people, there was an excellent documentary. I think it was just published by Declassified UK. It interviews, amongst others, Matthew Stavridis of Genocide Free Cyprus, whom we've had on this program before. And it details to a great degree exactly the role that Akrotiri has played in aiding and abetting Israel's genocide in Gaza with spy flights and so forth and military cargo. This now seems to be a subject about which a lot more is known previously, in no small part due to the wonderful reporting of Declassified UK. What is the sentiment amongst Cypriots today about Akrotiri's involvement in the genocide in Gaza? I know there have been protests, but has there been any kind of broad-based upswelling of opposition to Akrotiri, or is most Cypriots just sort of holding their noses and putting up with it?
I would say that Cypriots are behaving in a very passive way. Even in political discourse, they're aware. They'll say, we're aware, we're not happy about it. But they put on this particular display of helplessness. Well, there's nothing that we could do, when there is plenty that they could try to do in terms of, we don't want our any territory that's within our, land mass, even though technically they're supposed to be sovereign territories of the United Kingdom, anything that would threaten, the security of the Cypriot population. Because in the past, we have seen threats made towards, for example, bases that are going to be used even against, Lebanon, or Iran even issued certain threats along those lines, because obviously the Cypriot base, the British bases in Cyprus have been used to target not just to execute mass surveillance operations for Israel over Gaza, but also Yemen, Iraq, and maybe even possibly Iran, which hasn't been proven, but there's a potential behind it. So there's a degree of escalation that has taken place in terms of how these bases that are being used, that the Cypriot political class should be using and discussing, in terms of how and to what extent should we continue to accept the way that the British bases have been functioning, or the British bases overall, and question the colonial remnants of having those British bases there. But they haven't. There's this placated population that just simply observes, but seems to feel like there's nothing that they can do, when that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Or unfortunately, there's also a portion of the population who use the ideology that they go into this, or the mentality is, well, Cyprus has enough of its own problems, according to them. Why should I go and protest with regards to what's happening in Palestine? There's this mentality, I think it's a flawed mentality of, oh, well, we're occupied and nobody cares about that. So it's, unfortunately, haven't really realized the seriousness of the situation, not just of the use of the bases, but also our own international airports. The threat that Israelis have in terms of how they're, infiltrating our economies, how they're even outbidding a lot of Cypriots now in the real estate sector, etc. And also Israel's renewed interest and the West's interest in even their occupation. And they might even be looking at pretty much taking over even, or, taking over that occupation itself. I mean, this kind of rhetoric that's coming out of Israel, but a lot of Cypriots don't seem to be understanding this fundamentally as well, because this information isn't being relayed through the Cypriot media in a way that I think will allow people to understand, because the Cypriot media is in no way unbiased. It just regurgitates the point of the state, but also of the EU and the West. There seems to be a very little space for critical thinking and alternative sort of perspectives, unfortunately, in Cypriot media. And a lot of people here do tend to rely on their Cypriot media to understand what's happening in Cyprus, as opposed to, I guess, more international platforms. And they're not being given to understand the seriousness of Cyprus's geopolitical situation at the moment, and how the broader issues that are occurring, not just in West Asia, but the war, because we're currently seeing a sort of a crisis of the West, a crisis of its institutions, the rules-based order, of its financial capitalist infrastructure. It's really colliding and collapsing on itself, which is why it's acting out within West Asia, and it's trying to consolidate power here. Just to say, part and parcel of all these new alliances that, for example, I'll give you one classic example. Up until 2021, the East Med pipeline, for example, and all these projects that were supposed to bring, unite, establish trade routes between West Asia, Cyprus, and Greece, and Israel, essentially, were shut down. And the reason they were shut down was because they were not considered to be economically viable in any way, shape, or form. And I think actually in April of 2022, Victoria Nuland had actually even visited Cyprus, and she had outright said that the energy return investment here was going to be very low, that there wouldn't be any investors to basically come and build this kind of infrastructure, because it's just simply not enough gas reserves to even make up what Europe needs, first of all. And second of all, it's not economically viable. And there's such political turmoil within the region and instability, which would make it even more difficult. You have the occupation in Cyprus, you've got, disputes in Lebanon, then you've got the Palestine-Israeli situation. So it didn't seem that there was something that was feasible. Yet all of a sudden, because, the Ukraine war happened, fast forward a few years, they failed in those aspirations. We're seeing now the West take a new revised interest in the East Mediterranean pipeline. And in fact, in just this month alone, you saw the United States, the financial sort of defense minister, in Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and also the United States, in what they call the 3+1 energy managerial sort of alliance, who are coming together to supposedly revive the Eastern Mediterranean pipelines, and this is part of IMEC, which is, the counter proposal to BRICS, to the BRI in the region. And on top of that, they're doing the same thing with regards to as well the Great Sea Interconnector, which is the GSI, again, connecting energy between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. And all of these projects, these aspirational projects, are meant to, I guess, counter the West, counter China, counter the BRI, solidify and secure West Asia into the realm of Western influence, including supposedly to provide some sort of energy independence for Europe. But that's a fallacy in of itself. That's not even possible. Just for perspective, the Aphrodite field, which is the gas field that belongs to Cyprus, is, I think, 4.5 trillion cubic feet, and the entirety of what the Europe uses in a year is about 5.4. So I don't really know what they're going to do with any of this. And Israel has about 20 trillion cubic feet, so that's about a quarter of what Israel has as a whole. This whole project is insanity. But you can see how the West had these ambitions for West Asia that is meant to target China. It's meant to target the BRI, and Cyprus falls within that plan. And this is why they're also looking to deal with the occupation in the north as well, because part and parcel of establishing these trade routes means that there needs to be some sort of solution in the north, and this could possibly escalate to a very a violent situation if it's not handled properly, due to the tensions within Cyprus, its own political tensions that exist. And Cypriots seem to be completely unaware as to what their role is in this greater imperialist war, and how dangerous it is for them. Because at the end of the day, Cyprus is a frozen conflict. It's frozen, but at the slightest change, things could escalate here, and no one seems to be understanding the seriousness of that.
Mm-hmm. I must ask you this additional question, since you mentioned
of course.
Israeli influence over the island and its presence there. I've had 2 interactions myself with the Cypriot police in the last year
Yes.
as a result of my reporting on the Israeli presence in the island. The first time I tried to film a report about, I would say, 50 meters from the Israeli embassy in Nicosia. And I was standing there with a tripod, and the Israeli embassy was in the background. I was on Cypriot territory. I wasn't standing on the property of the embassy. And the cops immediately swarmed me, and they told me that if I tried to film there, I would be arrested. And they weren't nasty at the beginning. They were actually friendly, and they were almost apologetic about it. And when I insisted, I said, look, man, I'm on Cypriot land. Is there a law against this? And they couldn't tell me there was a law against it. I said, on Cypriot territory, so why do the Israelis get to dictate who can film here and who can't? I'm a journalist. Here's my press card. And they ended up calling the security at the Israeli embassy and asking them permission. And the security, the head of security, demanded to speak to me. And he told me, they handed me a cop's cell phone, and he told me that if I didn't go away, they were going to come down and arrest me. So I said, dude, come down. Try to arrest me on Cypriot soil. I dare you. And he didn't. And so there was kind of like a standoff. And then they called, the junior officers called a more senior officer from the Cypriot police, and he showed up. And he was very nasty. And he was like, I'm going to take you away now, throw you in jail. You got to get out of here. I'm not going to put up with this crap anymore. So I ended up leaving. So that was my first interaction. The second was the last time I was in Cyprus, I tried to film a report outside the it was a Jewish community center, which I had been told by locals was being used extensively by Israelis. So I went there just to see what was going on. This was in Larnaca. And I filmed, and a private security guard saw me just filming outside on public property. And he came over and he demanded that I delete my video. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a reporter. I showed him my press card. And then when I was leaving the country 2 days later from the Larnaca airport, they took me aside and told me I couldn't leave because I had to be interrogated by the criminal division of the Larnaca police. And they sent them down, and I had to miss my flight. And they wouldn't reimburse me for the new ticket. I had to pay for a new ticket. So anyways, that was my own personal experience. My question to you is this indicative of a broader, we see in the West that governments are basically becoming incredibly repressive in order to silence criticism of the genocidal entity. Is this happening in Cyprus too? Or is this are my experiences sort of typical of what defenders of Palestinian human rights are experiencing in Cyprus nowadays?
I think up until this point, I mean, they have tried to pass some laws that would even obstruct protesting. This has been something that's been ongoing, and the opposition party in Cyprus, the AGEL, which is the leftist opposition party, has been very vocal against this and has actually protested in protest of the anti-protest laws. But I would say there is a general crackdown and silencing that is happening in Cyprus as well. And in fact, for the first time during the flotilla was happening, and the flotilla was the most recent flotilla, when the flotilla activists were taken in, we did see immediate protests on the same night by lots of, these Cypriot movements that are very, pro-Palestine and question the Zionist entity. And there was heavy crackdown by the police. The police use, incredible levels of violence, and I think it was water cannons, if I'm not mistaken, and they brutalized a lot of the protesters, which again received a lot of backlash from the opposition. So and this is quite unusual for Cyprus, to be honest with you. I think it's a small country. Things are generally a little bit more laid back when in these sort of situations. This was not what happened on that night. So I would say there is a crackdown, and based on your experience as well and what you've just sort of expressed, it seems almost as if the police seems to be serving the interests of Israel and the state more so than caring about its own integrity as a sovereign state and protecting its own citizens. So yeah, I would say this is becoming a bit of a widespread phenomenon. But you have to also remember, Israel and Cyprus, alongside Greece, they also signed the Achilles Shield sort of alliance, which is like a counterterrorism and defense I guess, agreement that the three countries have come in. Now, what does this mean in terms of, a counterterrorism agreement with Israel? Just essentially means that you're aligning with Israel in order to surveillance even your own citizens of what's perceived as a threat towards Cyprus, but predominantly towards Israel. So if there are, Cypriot activists or individuals who are questioning Israel, this is going to be, is going to fall in line with this new strategic alliance now known as the Achilles heel, with Israel. Now, the whole purpose of establishing the Achilles heel was supposedly to counter Turkey. Like, there's a strong focus on Turkey, which kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier about, applying the pressure on the Turkish sort of military occupation, etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this means that now Cyprus has placed itself, the state has placed itself in a alliance with Israel that on counterterrorism, meaning anything. I mean, we know how Israelis define terrorism. Anything that questions the very state of Israel and its actions against Palestinians could be targeted along those lines. Any future, I guess, even escalation that Israel may have in the region, again, this will drag Cyprus and Greece right into that sort of same alliance, and placing, again, Cyprus and Greece even at a massive risk. And again, people are not aware of these things or the magnitude of what these, what this means for their own population, for their own safety, and particularly for a country like Cyprus that is dealing with its own occupation, its own internal turmoils. This is particularly vulnerable. But I think, unfortunately, this is why Israel is banking so much on Cyprus, because it's a population that's already divided. And so a population that's already divided is easy to infiltrate so long as you work the narratives that will sort of, inflame that internalized dichotomies and hatred and bigotry within society. And in some instances, that has been working here. But I imagine with these new alliances, especially on counterterrorism and defense, we're going to see more of these kind of crackdowns on anything that has to do with the state of Israel.
How ironic. How ironic they called it the Achilles heel. I mean, if anything's the Achilles heel for Greece and Cyprus, it's their alliance with the Zionist entity.
In itself.
Yes, exactly. In any case, it's been a great pleasure talking to you again, Elina. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today. We've gone almost 90 minutes. And
there you go. Whole football game.
Yeah.
We didn't even have any breaks.
I hope the good side won that match. So
I think we did.
I look forward to having conversations with you in the future. I hope we can do this again soon.
Of course, anytime. I'm pretty certain things are probably going to keep getting way worse. And I think it is important to bring attention to what's happening here, because not a lot of people do. And it is actually of significant geostrategic importance. So thank you for having me on and for bringing light to the situation, Dimitri, and keep doing what you do.
Thank you so much, Elina. You as well. And we're signing off today from Montreal and Cyprus on December 15, 2025.